Montana Territory, 1878. The scent of pine hung heavy in the mountain air as Xavier Dawson crouched by the stream, splashing cold water onto his sun-weathered face. At 26, he'd already lived enough frontier life for two men. The reflection that stared back at him from the rippling water showed a handsome face with sharp cheekbones, clear blue eyes, and 3 days of light stubble that he'd soon need to shave. A lock of dark hair fell across his forehead as he straightened his tall, lean frame. No sense in staying pretty out here, he muttered to himself, though he kept fastidiously clean compared to most of the cowhands. That discipline had been beaten into him during his brief stint with the cavalry after the war. It was one of the few useful things he'd carried away from those dark days. Xavier tightened the leather straps of his shoulder holster and checked his Colt revolver, a habit as natural as breathing. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest settlement of Pinewood Junction, a man couldn't afford to drop his guard. The Double Circle Ranch had been his home for 3 years now, and he'd worked his way up to foreman through sheer determination and a talent for handling both cattle and men. But that didn't mean he belonged, not truly. Xavier had learned early that attachment was dangerous in this unforgiving country. People died, they left, they betrayed. Better to keep moving, keep working, and never put down roots too deep. The frontier was no place for sentimentality, only survival. Xav, the voice of young Jimmy Curtis, barely 16 and eager as a puppy, called from the ridge above. "Mr. Hayward wants you back at the main house. Says there's trouble coming." Xavier nodded sharply, his face settling into the neutral mask he wore like armor. Whatever trouble Hayward had spotted, Xavier would handle it. That's what he did: solved problems, kept the ranch running, asked no questions beyond what he needed to know. It was simpler that way, cleaner. As he mounted his gray stallion, Thunder, and rode back toward the sprawling ranch house, he tried to ignore the emptiness that occasionally gnawed at him during quiet moments. The feeling that despite everything he'd built here, respect, position, a measure of security, something fundamental was missing. Doesn't matter, he told himself firmly. The frontier's no place for anything permanent. Especially not for a man like me. He had no way of knowing how quickly that belief was about to be challenged. 200 miles east, a dusty stagecoach rattled along the rutted trail toward Pinewood Junction. Inside, 20-year-old Ruby Kendrick gripped the worn leather seat as the vehicle hit another hole, sending her bouncing against the elderly gentleman beside her. Her honey-blonde hair had escaped its careful arrangement hours ago, and tendrils clung to her flushed cheeks. The pale blue traveling dress she'd thought so practical in Philadelphia now seemed foolishly delicate for the rugged journey. "Sorry, sir," she murmured, straightening her small hat, which was clinging precariously to what remained of her once neat hairstyle. The old man chuckled kindly. "No need for apologies, young lady. These western roads have bounced far heavier passengers than you." Ruby managed a tired smile. After 2 weeks of increasingly difficult travel, first by train and then by this bone-jarring stagecoach, she was beginning to question her decision. But what choice did she have? The letter had been clear. Her fiancé, Thomas Welling, had established himself with a respectable ranching position in Montana Territory and was finally ready to make her his bride. 3 years she'd waited. 3 years of letters that grew increasingly sporadic, of reassurances that grew increasingly vague. But Thomas had promised, and Ruby's options in Philadelphia had dwindled to either marrying her father's elderly business associate or facing spinsterhood as her family's fortunes declined. Thomas had promised a home, security, a future, and Ruby had been raised to believe that a promise was sacred. What she hadn't expected was his final letter redirecting her not to the town they'd originally discussed, but to this remote outpost called Pinewood Junction, with instructions to wait for him there. The letter had been dated nearly 3 months ago. She couldn't help worrying if he would even know she had arrived. "First time out west, I take it," the elderly gentleman interrupted her thoughts. "Is it that obvious?" Ruby asked, brushing dust from her sleeve. "You've got that look of someone whose expectations are being adjusted by the minute," he said with a knowing smile. "I'm Dr. Howard Belmore, by the way. Setting up practice in Pinewood." "Ruby Kendrick," she replied, accepting his handshake. "I'm meeting my fiancé. He works at a ranch near Pinewood Junction." "Well then," the doctor's face brightened, "a love story in the making. Which ranch might that be? I've made some inquiries about the area." "The Double Circle," Ruby said, feeling a small flutter of anticipation despite her exhaustion. Something shifted in Dr. Belmore's expression so briefly Ruby almost missed it. I see, he said after a pause. Well, it's one of the largest operations in the territory. Your fiancé must be well established. Before Ruby could inquire about his hesitation, the stagecoach lurched violently. The driver's panicked shouts and the sudden acceleration told her something was very wrong. Indians, she whispered, gripping her seat as childhood fears rushed to the surface. Outlaws more likely, Doctor. Belmore said grimly, peering out the small window. Highway robbery is more common than Indian troubles these days. The stagecoach careened around a bend, tilting dangerously before the unmistakable crack of gunfire split the air. Ruby barely had time to register what was happening before the vehicle lurched again, then pitched sideways with a splintering crash. Her last conscious thought was that Thomas would never know she had come all this way to meet him. Xavier and 3 ranch hands were riding the northern fence line when they heard the distant gunshots. He raised his hand, signaling the men to halt, and stood in his stirrups, scanning the horizon. That came from the stage road, said Cole Matthews, the oldest of the hands. Sounds like trouble. Xavier nodded grimly. Could be Rager's gang. They've been hitting stages between here and Fort Benton. He made a quick decision. Cole, ride back and get Hayward and some of the boys. Tell them to bring extra horses. We'll check it out. As the older man galloped back toward the ranch, Xavier led the remaining 2 hands toward the stagecoach road. They rode hard, weapons ready, following the faint trail of dust still visible in the distance. Xavier had no love for heroics, but he wouldn't ride away from people in danger. That wasn't the code he lived by, no matter how much he tried to keep his distance from others. They crested a rise and saw the overturned stagecoach below, its broken wheel still spinning lazily. 4 riders were visible, rifling through luggage and mailbags. The driver lay motionless beside the coach. Rager's men all right, whispered Ben Tucker, the youngest hand. I recognize Scarface Jenkins. Xavier assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. They haven't seen us yet. Ben, circle around to that outcropping and be ready with covering fire. Hank, you come with me. We'll approach from 2 sides. Wait for my signal. As the men moved into position, Xavier felt the familiar calm that always came before danger. This was simple, clear, not like the messiness of personal entanglements. Out here you could tell friend from foe, and problems could be solved with decisiveness and a steady hand. From his position behind a stand of pines, Xavier saw one of the outlaws pull someone from the stagecoach. A flash of pale blue fabric and golden hair caught the sunlight as a woman stumbled to her feet, clearly dazed but alive. An older man was being held at gunpoint nearby. Xavier's jaw tightened. He'd been prepared to engage for principle. Now it was personal. He gave the signal. The first shot from Ben's rifle took one outlaw by surprise, sending him tumbling from his horse. Xavier and Hank broke cover simultaneously, firing as they charged. The element of surprise worked in their favor as the outlaws scrambled to respond. Double circle riders, one shouted in warning. Xavier saw the outlaw nearest the woman raise his pistol, either to shoot her or use her as a shield. Without hesitation, Xavier fired, catching the man in the shoulder. As the outlaw fell, the woman bolted toward the rocks, showing more presence of mind than Xavier had expected. The remaining outlaws, outnumbered and exposed, decided retreat was their best option. They fired a few covering shots before galloping away, leaving their wounded companion behind. Xavier swung down from his horse, keeping his gun trained on the injured outlaw while Hank secured him. Only then did Xavier turn his attention to the survivors. It's safe to come out now, ma'am, he called toward the rocks where the woman had taken shelter. She emerged cautiously, and Xavier felt an unexpected jolt as he got his first clear look at her. Despite the dust covering her traveling dress and the golden hair tumbling in disarray around her shoulders, she was strikingly beautiful. Not in the painted, hard-edged way of saloon girls, but with a natural grace that seemed wildly out of place in this harsh landscape. She couldn't be older than 21 or 22, with delicate features and eyes that reminded him of spring violets, wide now with shock and fear. Thank you, she said, her voice steadier than her appearance would suggest. Are you from the law? No, ma'am, Xavier Dawson, foreman of the Double Circle Ranch. He touched the brim of his hat, surprised by his own formality. We heard the shots and came to investigate. Ruby Kendrick, she replied, then swayed slightly. Xavier moved forward instinctively, catching her elbow to steady her. The contact was brief, but something like an electric current passed between them. He withdrew his hand quickly, reminding himself of boundaries. "Are you hurt, Miss Kendrick?" "Just shaken," she assured him, though a small cut marred her forehead. But Dr. Belmore might need assistance. She gestured to the elderly gentleman who was now checking on the stagecoach driver. "The driver's alive," called Dr. Belmore. "But he needs proper medical attention soon." Xavier nodded, already calculating logistics. "More of our men are coming. We'll get you all to safety." He studied Ruby's face, noting the lingering shock behind her composed expression. "What brings you to these parts, Miss Kendrick? Not many young ladies travel this route alone." Something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or wariness. "I'm not traveling alone exactly. I'm meeting my fiancé. He works at a ranch near Pinewood Junction." She hesitated, then added with visible hope, "The Double Circle Ranch, actually. Perhaps you know Thomas Welling." The name hit Xavier like a physical blow. He kept his face carefully neutral, even as his mind raced through implications. Thomas Welling had indeed worked at the Double Circle, up until 6 months ago when he'd been caught stealing from the ranch and had fled ahead of the law. Xavier had personally tracked him as far as the Montana-Dakota border before being forced to return, and now his fiancée had arrived, clearly expecting to find him. "Miss Kendrick," Xavier began carefully, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. The ranch owner, Ethan Hayward, and 6 more hands had arrived. Xavier stepped away, grateful for the delay. How exactly did one tell a beautiful woman that she'd traveled thousands of miles to marry a thief who was long gone? Especially when she was already injured and in shock. That, Xavier decided, was a problem for after they'd reached the safety of the ranch. Ruby had never imagined her arrival in Montana territory would involve being thrown from an overturned stagecoach, hiding from outlaws, and then being rescued by ranch hands, particularly not by a man like Xavier Dawson. His presence commanded attention in a way that was impossible to ignore, from his tall frame to the quiet authority in his voice. Unlike the bombastic men she'd known back east, his competence required no announcement. Yet it was the momentary expression that had crossed his face when she mentioned Thomas that troubled her most. He'd hidden it quickly, but Ruby had caught it, a flash of something between surprise and concern. Now riding double with him toward the Double Circle Ranch, her trunk and valise somehow salvaged from the stagecoach wreckage and secured to a pack horse, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for the past hour. "Mr. Dawson," she began, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her, his arms carefully positioned around her to hold the reins without making inappropriate contact. "You never answered my question about Thomas Welling. Do you know him?" She felt rather than saw his hesitation, a momentary tension in his posture. "Miss Kendrick," he finally said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I think that conversation would be better had somewhere more private than on horseback. When we reach the ranch, we can speak freely." A cold knot formed in Ruby's stomach. "He isn't there anymore, is he?" Xavier remained silent for several beats. "No, Miss Kendrick, he's not." Something in his tone told her there was much more to the story, but she didn't press. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the day was catching up with her, and it took all her remaining strength to sit upright as they rode the final miles to the ranch. The Double Circle was larger than Ruby had imagined, a sprawling main house of sturdy logs and stone, surrounded by bunkhouses, barns, corrals, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Under different circumstances, she might have admired it. Now, she could only wonder what had happened to the future she'd been promised. As they dismounted in the ranch yard, a distinguished older man approached. His silver hair and trimmed beard framed a weathered but kindly face. "Miss Kendrick, this is Mr. Ethan Hayward, owner of the Double Circle," Xavier introduced. Hayward's eyes widened slightly at her name, Miss Kendrick. "Not Thomas Welling's young lady." Ruby nodded, feeling increasingly like a character in a play where everyone knew the script except her. "Yes, sir, I came west to join him." Hayward exchanged a glance with Xavier that confirmed her worst fears. "Something was very wrong. Let's get you settled first," Hayward said gently. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Cooper, will help you freshen up, and the doctor can tend to that cut on your head. Then we'll talk." Ruby allowed herself to be led into the house, where a motherly woman with graying hair clucked sympathetically over her disheveled state and whisked her upstairs. In a daze, Ruby found herself bathed, her cut cleaned and bandaged by Dr. Belmore, and dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe. Mrs. Cooper insisted she eat something, though Ruby barely tasted the soup and bread placed before her. When Xavier and Mr. Hayward finally entered the small sitting room where she waited, Ruby had composed herself as best she could. Whatever news they brought, she would face it with dignity. "Miss Kendrick," Hayward began, taking a seat across from her, "I'm afraid I have difficult news. Thomas Welling is no longer employed at the Double Circle. He left under unfortunate circumstances 6 months ago." "What circumstances?" Ruby asked, her voice remarkably steady. Hayward glanced at Xavier, who stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "He was caught stealing from the ranch," Xavier said bluntly. "Cash and valuables from the safe, as well as some valuable horses he sold across the territory line." Ruby felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Miss Kendrick," Hayward said gently. "We had proof. When confronted, he fled. Xavier tracked him as far as the Dakota Territory border, but we had to give up the pursuit." "And his letters," Ruby whispered. "He's been writing to me all this time, telling me to come join him here." Xavier's jaw tightened. "When was the last letter dated?" 3 months ago. "Posted from where?" Ruby tried to remember. It didn't say specifically. "Just that I should come to Pinewood Junction and wait for him at the hotel there." Xavier and Hayward exchanged another look. "Miss Kendrick," Hayward said carefully, "it appears that Thomas has misled you. There's no indication he intended to return here, quite the opposite. Coming back would mean facing charges." The full weight of her situation crashed down on Ruby. She had traveled thousands of miles, spent nearly her entire savings, and burned her bridges back east, all to join a man who had apparently never intended to meet her. She was alone in a strange territory with no immediate prospects and limited funds. "I see," she said faintly, fighting back tears. Pride was all she had left, and she wouldn't surrender it by breaking down in front of these men. "Thank you for your honesty." "You're welcome to stay here until you decide what you want to do," Hayward offered kindly. "We've plenty of room, and Mrs. Cooper would appreciate another woman around the place." "That's very generous," Ruby managed, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Hayward insisted. "Consider it frontier hospitality." After they left her alone, Ruby finally allowed her tears to fall. Everything she had built her future on had crumbled beneath her. Thomas, the man she had trusted with her heart and future, had betrayed her in the most fundamental way, yet beneath the devastation, a small spark of anger kindled. She had not traveled all this way to simply give up. Somehow she would find her footing in this harsh new land. She had to. Xavier couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch of his cabin, staring at the stars scattered like diamond dust across the Montana night sky. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind: the attack, the rescue, and most persistently, the look in Ruby Kendrick's eyes when she learned the truth about Thomas Welling. He'd seen that particular mix of shock, betrayal, and grief before, in his own reflection years ago. "Not your problem, Dawson," he muttered to himself, lighting a cigarette. Ruby Kendrick was Hayward's concern now. The ranch owner had offered her shelter, and that was that. Xavier had done his duty by helping rescue her and telling her the truth about Welling. The fact that he couldn't stop thinking about the quiet dignity with which she'd received the devastating news, or the delicate curve of her cheek as she'd fought back tears. That was irrelevant. Attachment was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson through blood and loss. His job was to run the ranch, not get entangled in the problems of a beautiful Eastern woman who had no place in his carefully ordered existence. Yet when he finally returned to bed, his dreams were filled with honey-blonde hair and violet eyes. The next morning, Xavier was surprised to find Ruby in the ranch kitchen, her hair neatly braided and pinned, wearing a simple borrowed dress that Mrs. Cooper must have provided. She was helping prepare breakfast, moving with purpose despite the shadows beneath her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Dawson," she said when she noticed him in the doorway. "Miss Kendrick," he acknowledged with a nod. "You're up early." "I've never been one for lying abed," she replied, continuing to slice bread, "and Mrs. Cooper has kindly allowed me to make myself useful." Xavier studied her, impressed despite himself. Many women of her background would have collapsed under the weight of what she'd endured yesterday, yet here she was, shoulders straight, facing a new day. "Will you be returning east?" he asked, accepting the coffee Mrs. Cooper handed him. Something flashed in Ruby's eyes, determination perhaps, No, I have very little to return to in Philadelphia. My parents are both gone, and what family remains couldn't support another dependent. I need to make my own way now. And how do you plan to do that in Pinewood Junction? The question came out more challenging than he'd intended. I've been trained as a teacher, she said simply. I intend to inquire if the settlement needs one, and if not, I'll find other respectable work. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Dawson. For some reason, Xavier found himself wanting to test that claim. The frontier isn't like Philadelphia, Miss Kendrick. It breaks people who aren't prepared for its hardships. Then I shall have to avoid breaking, won't I? She replied with unexpected spirit, a flash of fire in those violet eyes. I may have been foolish enough to trust Thomas, but that doesn't make me a fool in all things. Xavier found himself fighting an unexpected smile. No, I don't believe it does. Their exchange was interrupted by Hayward's entrance. The ranch owner looked between them curiously before addressing Ruby. Miss Kendrick, I've been thinking about your situation. As it happens, the double circle is in need of someone to tutor my foreman's children. Our previous teacher left last month to be married. Xavier stared at his employer in confusion. Your foreman's children. My nieces and nephews, Hayward clarified, my sister's family in Helena. They're coming to stay for several months while she recovers from illness, remember, 4 children between the ages of 6 and 12. He turned back to Ruby. It would be a temporary position, of course, but it would give you time to establish yourself in the territory, make connections, and decide on your next steps. Xavier watched conflicting emotions cross Ruby's face, relief, gratitude, and wariness. That's extraordinarily kind, she said carefully, but I wouldn't want charity. It's not charity, Hayward assured her. Those children need proper schooling, and I need someone who can provide it. You'd have room and board plus a small salary, and perhaps you could help Mrs. Cooper with some of the household accounts. I understand you have some skill with figures. Ruby nodded, clearly wondering how he knew this. Your letter of recommendation was in your trunk, Hayward explained. Mrs. Cooper found it while helping unpack your things. It speaks very highly of your abilities as both teacher and bookkeeper. Xavier watched as Ruby considered the offer. He should have been relieved that Hayward had found a neat solution to her predicament, one that would keep her at a proper distance while giving her time to land on her feet. Instead, he felt an unexpected disquiet at the thought of her living in the main house, becoming part of daily ranch life. I accept your offer with gratitude, Mr. Hayward, Ruby finally said. And I promise I won't disappoint you. Excellent, Hayward beamed. The children arrive next week. In the meantime, you can rest and become familiar with the ranch. He turned to Xavier. Perhaps you could show Miss Kendrick around today. Give her an understanding of our operation. Xavier opened his mouth to suggest one of the other hands could do it, but found himself saying instead, of course. As he left to prepare for the day's work, Xavier couldn't help wondering why the prospect of showing Ruby Kendrick around the double circle made him both uneasy and oddly anticipatory. It was just frontier courtesy, he told himself, nothing more. The lie rang hollow even in his own mind. Ruby had never imagined herself riding astride a horse, wearing men's denims under her skirt, but here she was, following Xavier Dawson along a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of the Double Circle Ranch. The indignity was worth the practicality, she decided, as she handled the gentle mare he'd selected for her with growing confidence. The Double Circle runs nearly 20,000 acres, Xavier explained, gesturing to the landscape spread before them. Hayward's built it from almost nothing over 15 years. Those northern pastures are where we graze the main herd, and over that ridge to the east is where we keep the breeding stock. Ruby tried to absorb it all, the sheer scale of the operation dwarfing anything she'd known back east. It's magnificent, she said honestly, so much space and freedom. Xavier glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his blue eyes. Most Easterners find it desolate. It's not desolate, Ruby disagreed. It's honest. The land doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is, unlike people. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Xavier studied her for a moment. Welling didn't deserve your loyalty. Clearly not, she agreed, trying to keep the pain from her voice. But that doesn't make the betrayal easier to bear. They rode in silence for a while before Xavier spoke again. May I ask how you came to be engaged to him? Ruby hesitated, then decided there was little point in secrecy now. We met when I was 17. He worked as a clerk for my father's shipping business in Philadelphia. He was charming, attentive, and my parents approved, at first. Then my father's business began to fail, and Thomas announced he was going west to seek his fortune. He promised to send for me once he was established. And you waited all this time? Xavier asked, his tone carefully neutral. 3 years, Ruby confirmed. At first his letters came regularly. He wrote of building a future for us, then they grew less frequent, more vague, but what choice did I have? My father died last year, leaving my mother and me with almost nothing. When she passed this spring, I had to either marry my father's elderly business associate who had offered for me, or come west to Thomas. Xavier's expression darkened. So he knew you had nowhere else to turn. Yes, Ruby said softly, I suppose he did. They crested another hill, and Xavier reined in his horse, pointing to a small cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees near a stream. That's my place, he said unexpectedly. Hayward lets his foreman have a separate cabin instead of bunking with the hands. Ruby studied the neat little structure, surprised by the glimpse into his personal space. It looks peaceful. It serves its purpose. His tone was dismissive, but Ruby sensed something deeper, as if the isolation of the cabin represented something important to him. Have you always been a rancher? She asked, genuinely curious about this man whose quiet intensity both intimidated and intrigued her. Xavier hesitated. No, I was a soldier first. Joined up near the end of the war, though I was too young to see much fighting. Stayed and afterward, served with the cavalry for a few years. What made you leave? His jaw tightened. I had my reasons. The abrupt closure of the subject was clear, and Ruby didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. Certainly, she hadn't shared everything about her own life, like the crushing weight of her parents' expectations, or how her engagement to Thomas had been as much about security as affection. As they rode back toward the ranch, a shout from the distance caught their attention. One of the ranch hands was galloping toward them, waving urgently. Trouble, Xav, the young man called as he neared. Hayward sent me to find you. Rager's gang hit the Petersons' place last night, burned them out. Xavier's expression hardened. Anyone hurt? Peterson took a bullet in the shoulder. His wife and kids are fine there at the main house now. Hayward's called a meeting of all the ranchers. Thinks it's time to put together a posse and end this for good. Xavier nodded grimly. Tell him I'll be right there. As the hand galloped away, Xavier turned to Ruby. I need to get you back to the ranch. Who's Rager? Ruby asked as they urged their horses into a faster pace. Lee Rager leads the gang that attacked your stagecoach, Xavier explained tersely. They've been terrorizing this part of the territory for months, rustling cattle, robbing stages, and now burning out homesteaders. The law's too thin out here to handle it, so it falls to us. The cold efficiency in his voice sent a shiver down Ruby's spine. This was a different Xavier from the man who had patiently explained ranch operations to her. This was the competent, dangerous man who had driven off armed outlaws without hesitation. Will you join the posse? She asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, his tone left no room for argument. It's my responsibility. That night, as Ruby sat in her comfortable room in the main house, she could see lights burning in the bunkhouse where the men were making preparations. Tomorrow, Xavier and most of the able-bodied hands would ride out with ranchers from neighboring properties to hunt down Rager and his gang. The thought of Xavier facing such danger troubled her more than it should, given their brief acquaintance. She told herself it was natural concern for someone who had rescued her, nothing more. But when sleep finally came, her dreams were haunted by gunfire and the image of Xavier falling, just as the stagecoach driver had fallen. The posse had been gone for 3 days when Ruby found herself in Hayward's study, helping organize the ranch accounts. Mrs. Cooper had been right about her need for assistance. The housekeeper was efficient with household matters, but had limited experience with the complex financial records of a large ranching operation. You have a genuine talent for this, Miss Kendrick, Hayward remarked, reviewing her work. These books haven't been this orderly since my wife passed 5 years ago. Ruby smiled, pleased by the compliment. Thank you, sir. I've always had an affinity for numbers and organization. Hayward studied her thoughtfully. You know, the double circle could use someone with your skills on a permanent basis. Once my sister's children return to Helena, you might consider staying on in a different capacity. The offer surprised Ruby. That's very kind, but she was interrupted by the sound of horses in the yard. Hayward moved quickly to the window. They're back, he said with visible relief, and I don't see any obvious injuries. Ruby followed him outside, where the returning men were dismounting, dusty and exhausted. Her eyes immediately sought Xavier. He stood by his horse, speaking quietly with another rancher. A dark bruise marred one cheekbone, and he held himself stiffly, suggesting other injuries, but he was alive and standing. Relief washed through her with unexpected intensity. Well, Hayward asked as the men gathered around. We got 3 of them, Xavier reported, his voice weary. Rager and 2 others escaped into the mountains. We tracked them as far as we could, but they know that country too well. Any casualties on our side? Frank Townsend took a bullet in the leg. Doc Belmore's tending to him at his place in town. Everyone else is just banged up. Hayward nodded grimly. Get some food and rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. As the men dispersed, Xavier's gaze finally found Ruby. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her presence, or at the obvious concern she knew must be visible on her face. Miss Kendrick, he said with a nod, his tone carefully formal despite the weariness etched into his features. Mr. Dawson, she replied just as formally, I'm glad to see you returned safely. Before he could respond, Mrs. Cooper bustled up with demands that he come inside immediately to have his injuries tended. Ruby watched as he was led away, noting how he moved with careful control, masking pain. Later that evening, Ruby found herself walking toward the kitchen with a tray of empty teacups when she heard voices from Hayward's study. The door stood slightly ajar, and Xavier's words drifted clearly to her ears. Can't just let it go, Ethan. Rager will see this as a challenge. He'll hit another ranch within the month, and next time he'll be better prepared. I understand that, Hayward replied, but you're talking about going after him alone. That's suicide, Xavier. Not alone, I'll take Ben and Cole. We'll move faster than a full posse, attract less attention. And if you find them, 3 against however many Rager has left. We won't engage unless we have the advantage. This is about tracking them to their hideout, learning their patterns. Ruby knew she should walk away. That eavesdropping was inexcusable, but concern rooted her to the spot. You've been pushing yourself too hard since Mary died, Hayward said more softly, taking risks no sane man would consider. Is that what she would have wanted? A long silence followed, so tense Ruby could feel it even through the partially closed door. Don't, Xavier finally said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't get to use her name like that. Someone needs to remind you that your life has value, Hayward pressed. You act like you're expendable, Xavier, like it wouldn't matter if you didn't come back one day. We're all expendable out here, Xavier replied flatly. The territory doesn't care who lives or dies. It just keeps going. Is that what you really believe? Then why risk yourself to protect others? Why ride out after outlaws or rescue stagecoach passengers? Another silence. Get some rest, Hayward finally said. We'll discuss this tomorrow when you're thinking more clearly. Ruby hurried away before the door could open, her mind spinning with questions. Who was Mary? What had happened that made Xavier so willing to risk his life? And why did the thought of him riding out to face Rager alone fill her with such dread? The next morning, Ruby was helping Mrs. Cooper with breakfast preparations when Xavier entered the kitchen. His bruise had darkened overnight, but he moved with less stiffness. Their eyes met briefly before he nodded a greeting to both women and accepted a cup of coffee. You're up early after such a long ride, Mrs. Cooper remarked. I'd have thought you'd sleep till noon. Too much to do, Xavier replied. The north pasture fence still needs repair, and we're behind on moving the breeding stock. Ruby couldn't help herself. Surely that can wait until you've properly recovered. Xavier's gaze sharpened on her. Cattle don't wait, Miss Kendrick. Neither do ranch responsibilities. And neither, apparently, does your determination to go after Lee Rager again, she said before she could stop herself. Xavier's cup froze halfway to his lips. Beg pardon. Heat flooded Ruby's cheeks as she realized her slip. I overheard some of your conversation with Mr. Hayward last night. I apologize for the intrusion, but I was concerned. His expression hardened. It's not your concern, Miss Kendrick. Perhaps not, she conceded, but it seems unnecessarily reckless to pursue dangerous outlaws with just 2 companions when you've barely recovered from the first attempt. Xavier set his cup down with careful precision. With all due respect, you've been in this territory less than a week. You don't understand how things work out here. I understand that throwing your life away won't solve anything, Ruby persisted, driven by an emotion she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Something dangerous flashed in Xavier's eyes. I didn't ask for your opinion on the matter. No, but perhaps you should ask yourself why you're so eager to risk your life, Ruby countered. Mr. Hayward seems to think. Enough, Xavier's voice cut like a knife. Whatever you think you understand about me or my motivations, Miss Kendrick, you don't. So I suggest you focus on the children arriving tomorrow and leave ranch business to those who understand it. He stalked out, leaving Ruby staring after him, hurt and confusion warring in her chest. Mrs. Cooper's gentle hand on her arm startled her. Don't take it personally, dear, the older woman said kindly. Xavier's always been that way about certain subjects. Especially anything touching on Mary. Who was she? Ruby asked quietly. Mrs. Cooper sighed. His wife. She died 3 years ago just after they arrived here. Fever took her in less than a week. Xavier's never been the same since. The revelation hit Ruby like a physical blow. Xavier had been married, had loved and lost in the cruelest way. I didn't know, she whispered. He doesn't speak of it, Mrs. Cooper said. But those of us who were here then, we remember how it changed him. Before, he was different, more open, more alive. After, he just closed up, does his job better than anyone but keeps himself apart. Like he's afraid to care about anything or anyone again. Ruby thought of Xavier's insistence on isolation, his cabin separate from the others, his careful distance from everyone except when duty required otherwise. It made a terrible kind of sense now. Thank you for telling me, she said to Mrs. Cooper. I'll be more careful in the future. But as she went about her day, Ruby couldn't stop thinking about Xavier, not just the hard, competent foreman she'd come to know, but the man who had loved so deeply that losing that love had fundamentally changed him. She recognized something of herself in that pain, in the fear of trusting again after betrayal. Thomas hadn't died, but he had abandoned her after years of promises. The wounds were different, but perhaps the fear was the same. That evening, unable to sleep, Ruby stepped onto the porch of the main house for some air. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead, the air cool and fragrant with pine. In the distance, she could see a light burning in Xavier's cabin. Without fully understanding her own motivation, she found herself walking toward it. Xavier sat at his small table, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. The familiar routine required little thought, leaving his mind free to circle the same frustrating track it had been on all day. Ruby Kendrick's words kept echoing in his head. Throwing your life away won't solve anything. What did she know about it? She'd been in Montana territory less than a week. She didn't understand the realities of frontier justice, the necessities of survival, the code by which men lived and died out here. Yet something in her direct challenge had struck a nerve. Perhaps because it had come so close to Hayward's accusation, that he'd been taking unnecessary risks since Mary died, as if his own life held little value. Was that true? Xavier's hands stilled on the gun. Had he been seeking danger, courting death in some unconscious way? The thought was uncomfortable, challenging the careful narrative he'd constructed for himself, that he was simply doing what needed to be done, that his willingness to face danger was about protection, not self-destruction. A soft knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. He placed the revolver on the table and moved cautiously to answer it, one hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Ruby Kendrick stood on his doorstep, a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the night chill. The surprise of seeing her there, alone at night at his cabin, momentarily robbed him of speech. I apologize for disturbing you so late, she said, her voice soft in the quiet night, but I needed to speak with you privately. Xavier knew he should send her away immediately. A single woman visiting a man's cabin after dark violated every social convention, yet he found himself stepping back, opening the door wider. Come in, he said, then added belatedly, though you shouldn't be here, Miss Kendrick. I know, she acknowledged, stepping inside. But what I have to say couldn't wait until morning. She glanced at the dismantled revolver on the table. I've interrupted your work. It's routine maintenance, Xavier said, closing the door but leaving it slightly ajar for propriety's sake. What was so urgent it couldn't wait for daylight? Ruby took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize for speaking out of turn this morning. Mrs. Cooper told me about your wife. I didn't know, and I'm truly sorry for your loss. Xavier's chest tightened painfully. Mrs. Cooper had no right to share that information. Perhaps not, Ruby conceded, but I'm glad she did. It helps me understand you better. There's nothing to understand, Xavier said flatly. It was 3 years ago. Some wounds don't heal with time alone, Ruby said quietly. I know something of loss myself. Not the same as yours, certainly, but enough to recognize when someone is still carrying their pain like a shield. Xavier felt exposed in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Is that all you came to say? No, Ruby's violet eyes held his steadily. I also came to tell you that I understand why you feel you need to go after Rager again. It's not just about justice or protection. It's about having a purpose, a mission that makes sense when nothing else does. The accuracy of her assessment was unsettling. You've known me less than a week, Miss Kendrick. Don't presume to understand my motivations. Perhaps I understand them because they're not so different from my own, she replied. When Thomas's letters grew less frequent, I doubled down on my commitment to him. I needed to believe in that future because the alternative was too frightening, being alone, having to build a life without the certainty I thought I had. She paused. Is it possible that hunting outlaws gives you the same kind of certainty, a clear purpose when everything else feels empty? Xavier turned away, unable to bear the gentle insight in her eyes. This isn't about me. It's about protecting the people and property of this valley. Yes, it is, Ruby agreed, but it's also about you, Xavier. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something in the way she said it made his heart constrict. About whether you believe your life has value beyond what you can do for others. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Don't I? Ruby stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. I saw how you handled yourself during the stagecoach rescue. You're not reckless by nature. You're precise, careful, measured. The only time you take unnecessary risks is when you're chasing outlaws, men like those who attacked my stagecoach. Xavier finally turned to face her. What's your point? My point is that there might be a reason you're so driven to hunt these particular men, something beyond duty or justice. The insight struck too close to a truth Xavier had buried deep. His jaw tightened. You should go back to the house. It's not proper for you to be here. Ruby didn't move. Before I go, I want you to know that whatever you decide about pursuing Rager, there are people who care whether you come back. Mr. Hayward, Mrs. Cooper, the ranch hands who look up to you. She hesitated, then added softly, and me. The simple confession hung in the air between them. Xavier stared at her, this woman who had arrived in his life less than a week ago, yet somehow saw through the careful walls he'd built around himself. You don't know me, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I know enough, Ruby replied. I know you're a good man who's been through something terrible. I know you protect others even at cost to yourself. And I know that when you found me at that stagecoach wreck, something changed for both of us. Xavier couldn't deny it. From the moment he'd seen Ruby stumbling away from the overturned coach, something had shifted in his carefully ordered world. A crack had formed in the wall he'd built after Mary's death, small at first, but widening with every interaction, every glimpse of Ruby's courage and grace. It doesn't matter, he said, fighting against the pull he felt toward her. I have responsibilities. Rager and his gang are still out there. Yes, they are, Ruby agreed, and they need to be brought to justice. But there's a difference between pursuing justice and seeking destruction, theirs or your own. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the latch. Just promise me you'll think about what I've said, about why you're so determined to go after them alone. After she left, Xavier stood motionless in the center of his cabin, her words echoing in his mind. Had he been seeking his own destruction, using duty and justice to mask a deeper, darker desire to join Mary in death? The question haunted him through a sleepless night, along with the memory of violet eyes that somehow saw too much. The arrival of Hayward's nieces and nephews the next day transformed the ranch house with youthful energy and noise. Ruby found herself immediately immersed in establishing routines, assessing their educational levels, and creating lesson plans appropriate for each child. Elizabeth, the oldest at 12, was a serious girl who had already developed a love of books. James, 10, was all boyish energy and curiosity about ranch operations. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, 6 years old and inseparable, required constant attention and engagement. Ruby threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from her confused feelings about Xavier and her uncertain future. Teaching came naturally to her, and seeing the children respond to her guidance brought genuine satisfaction. She saw little of Xavier in the days that followed. He seemed to be keeping his distance, burying himself in ranch work from dawn until dusk. She caught glimpses of him directing hands in the corrals or riding out with the morning crew, but their paths rarely crossed directly. Only once, passing in the yard as Ruby was escorting the children to an outdoor science lesson, did they exchange more than basic courtesies. "The children seem to be responding well to your instruction," Xavier observed, pausing beside his horse. "They're bright and eager to learn," Ruby replied, studying his face for signs of his decision about pursuing Rager. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Miss Ruby, are you coming?" called Samuel impatiently from the garden. "In a moment," she answered before turning back to Xavier. "Have you given any more thought to our conversation?" Something shifted in his expression. "I have. I'm still going," he said quietly, "but not alone, and not without proper preparation. Hayward and I have been working with the marshal in Helena to coordinate a larger operation." Relief mingled with lingering concern in Ruby's chest. "That sounds considerably more reasonable." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Reasonableness wasn't my strong suit after Mary died. Perhaps it's time to reconsider that approach." Before Ruby could respond, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her with the sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. That evening, as Ruby was helping the children with their studies in the ranch house library, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. James rushed to the window. "Riders coming," he announced excitedly. "Lots of them." Ruby joined him at the window, counting at least 10 mounted men approaching the ranch. "Go find your uncle," she instructed, a sense of unease growing as she noted the manner in which the men rode, bunched together, weapons visible. Hayward appeared moments later, his expression grim. "Take the children upstairs, Miss Kendrick. Keep them there until I come for you." "What's happening?" she asked, already gathering the younger twins. "That's Lee Rager and his gang," Hayward said tersely. "Xavier and most of the hands are out with the herd. We're short-handed." Fear clutched at Ruby's heart. "What do they want?" "Nothing good," Hayward replied, checking his revolver. "Go now." Ruby hurried the children upstairs to their bedroom, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "We're going to play a quiet game," she told them, closing the curtains. "Everyone needs to stay very still and very silent." "Are those bad men?" Sarah whispered, her small face pinched with fear. "Your uncle and the ranch hands will handle everything," Ruby assured her, though her own heart raced with terror. She positioned herself by the window where she could peek through a gap in the curtains without being seen from outside. In the yard below, the riders had formed a loose semicircle facing the main house. A tall man with a scarred face who could only be Lee Rager sat on a large black horse at their center. Hayward stood on the porch, flanked by the few hands who had remained at the ranch. "What can I do for you, Rager?" Hayward's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "You can tell me where to find Xavier Dawson," Rager replied, his tone deceptively casual. "He killed my brother during your little posse adventure." "I aim to return the favor." Ruby's blood ran cold. Xavier had killed Rager's brother. No wonder the outlaw had come in force. "Dawson's not here," Hayward said evenly. "And if he was, what makes you think I'd hand him over?" Rager smiled, the expression chilling even from a distance. "Because if you don't, we'll burn this place to the ground, starting with that fancy house of yours. I wonder how many people are inside right now." Ruby instinctively pulled the children closer, gathering them against her in a protective huddle. "You won't find Dawson here," Hayward repeated, "and attacking this ranch would be a mistake. The law is already looking for you after what happened at the Peterson place." Rager laughed harshly. "The law, out here, you're funnier than I remember, Hayward," he gestured to his men. "Search the bunkhouses and outbuildings. If Dawson's hiding, drag him out." As the outlaws dispersed to search the property, Ruby's mind raced. Xavier was indeed away with most of the hands, but they could return at any time, riding into an ambush. And in the meantime, everyone at the ranch was in danger. "Miss Ruby," Elizabeth whispered, "what's going to happen?" "We're going to stay very quiet," Ruby replied, her mind working frantically, "and trust that help will come." But as she watched the outlaws systematically searching the ranch buildings, she realized that help might not arrive in time. Rager was growing visibly impatient, his men returning one by one to report that Xavier was nowhere to be found. "I think you're lying to me, Hayward," Rager finally called. "I think Dawson's here and you're protecting him." "Search the house if you don't believe me," Hayward replied, his voice steady despite the danger. Ruby's heart nearly stopped. If Rager's men came inside, there would be nowhere to hide. The children would be discovered, and there was no telling what these men might do. "Miss Ruby, I'm scared," Samuel whimpered against her side. "SHH, it's all right," she soothed automatically, her mind racing. There had to be something she could do, some way to protect these children. An idea came to her, desperate, perhaps foolish, but possibly their only chance. She quickly gathered the children around her. "Listen carefully," she whispered. "I need you to stay here completely silent no matter what happens. Elizabeth, you're in charge. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but your uncle or me. Understand?" The oldest girl nodded solemnly, though fear shone in her eyes. "Where are you going?" "To help," Ruby said simply, smoothing her dress and checking that her hair was neat. "Remember, complete silence." Before she could reconsider, Ruby slipped from the room, waiting until she heard the lock click behind her before moving toward the stairs. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it must be audible, but her steps remained steady as she descended to the main floor. Taking a deep breath, Ruby opened the front door and stepped onto the porch beside Hayward. His look of shock quickly gave way to alarm. "Miss Kendrick, get back inside," he hissed. Instead, Ruby moved forward, summoning every ounce of the poise and confidence she'd been taught as a Philadelphia society lady. She fixed her gaze on Rager, noting the momentary surprise that crossed his scarred face at her appearance. "Mr. Rager," she called clearly, "I believe I'm the one you're actually looking for." Xavier and his men were 5 miles from the ranch when they spotted the dust cloud of multiple riders heading toward the double circle. Something about the formation immediately raised his suspicions. They weren't riding like ranch hands or friendly neighbors. "Trouble," he said tersely to Ben Tucker, who rode beside him. "That many riders this time of evening, moving that fast." Ben squinted toward the distant figures. "Can't be Rager, can it? He wouldn't have the nerve to hit the main ranch." "Revenge makes men bold," Xavier replied grimly, thinking of the outlaw he'd killed during the posse's pursuit, a man he'd later learned was Rager's younger brother. "And Rager's got plenty of reason to want me dead." Cold dread settled in Xavier's stomach as he thought of who was at the ranch: Hayward, Mrs. Cooper, the few hands left behind, the children, and Ruby. Ruby, who had looked at him with those clear violet eyes and told him his life had value. Ruby, who had somehow seen through the walls he'd built around his heart. "Ride hard for the ranch," he ordered. "But we approach quiet-like from the east ravine. If it is Rager, we need to assess before charging in." As they rode, Xavier found himself praying for the first time since Mary's death. Not for himself, but for Ruby and the others at the ranch. The thought of Rager's men anywhere near her filled him with a fear more potent than anything he'd felt in years. They approached the ranch from the sheltered eastern ravine as planned, dismounting to advance on foot through the cover of pine trees. What Xavier saw when they reached a vantage point overlooking the ranch yard froze his blood. Rager and his gang had surrounded the main house. Hayward stood on the porch, clearly trying to negotiate. And beside him, impossibly, inexplicably, stood Ruby Kendrick, her head high, addressing Rager directly. "What the hell is she doing?" Ben whispered beside him. Xavier couldn't answer. His mind was racing, calculating odds, distances, lines of fire. There were 11 outlaws that he could see, all armed. He had 8 men with him. They had the element of surprise, but Rager's men were too close to the house, to Ruby. "Ben, take Williams and circle around to the bunkhouse. Cole, you and Peterson get to the barn. The rest of you spread out along this ridge. Don't fire until my signal, and when you do, aim for the outlaws furthest from the house first." As the men moved into position, Xavier strained to hear what was happening below. Ruby's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "I believe I'm the one you're actually looking for." What game was she playing? Xavier wondered with growing alarm. What could she possibly hope to achieve by drawing Rager's attention? And who might you be, little lady? Rager's mocking voice replied. My name is Ruby Kendrick. I was on the stagecoach your men attacked 3 days ago, the one that Xavier Dawson and his men interrupted. Her voice remained remarkably steady. I believe that makes me a witness to your crimes, Mr. Rager. Xavier's heart pounded against his ribs. She was deliberately making herself a target, drawing Rager's focus away from the house, away from the children who must be inside. Is that so? Rager's voice held dangerous amusement. And you think that matters to me? I think it matters very much, Ruby replied calmly. Especially since I've written a detailed account of everything I witnessed, including descriptions of you and your men, and sent copies to both the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal's office in Helena. Xavier almost gasped aloud at her audacity. It was a bluff, it had to be, but delivered with such conviction that even from his distance, he could see Rager's posture change. You're lying, Rager said, but uncertainty had crept into his tone. Am I? Ruby challenged. Test that theory if you wish, Mr. Rager, but know that harming me or anyone at this ranch will only guarantee that federal marshals will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Your brother's death was just the beginning. The tension in the yard was palpable now. Xavier could see Rager's men exchanging glances, clearly unnerved by this unexpected development. Rager himself sat straighter in his saddle, his hand hovering near his gun. You've got nerve, lady, I'll give you that, Rager finally said, but if you think. He never finished the sentence. A rider came galloping up the road, one of Rager's lookouts based on his rough appearance. Riders coming, the man shouted, at least 20, moving fast from the direction of town. Xavier frowned in confusion. He knew of no large group that should be approaching from that direction. Rager's face darkened with suspicion. Another bluff. Ruby merely smiled. I told you, Mr. Rager, I sent letters to the marshal's office. Did you think they wouldn't respond? For a long, tense moment, Xavier thought Rager might order his men to open fire out of sheer rage and frustration, but the outlaw leader was too canny, too experienced in survival. Mount up, he finally snarled to his men. This isn't over, Hayward, or you, Miss Kendrick, not by a long shot. As the outlaws wheeled their horses and galloped away from the ranch, Xavier released the breath he'd been holding. He signaled his men to hold their positions. They were still outnumbered, and forcing a confrontation now could endanger everyone at the ranch. Only when Rager's gang had disappeared over the ridge did Xavier lead his men down to the ranch yard. The mysterious riders from town turned out to be a single wagon and 2 outriders, the regular supply delivery from Pinewood Junction, magnified by dust and distance into seeming like a much larger force. Xavier dismounted in a fluid motion and strode directly to where Ruby stood on the porch. Relief and anger warred within him as he approached, relief that she was unharmed, anger that she had put herself at such risk. What were you thinking? He demanded, his voice harsher than he'd intended. Ruby met his gaze steadily. I was thinking that Rager was about to search the house where 4 children were hiding. I needed to distract him, give him a different target. You could have been killed, Xavier said, the words strangled by the fear he'd felt seeing her facing down Rager. But I wasn't, she replied simply. And neither were the children. Xavier wanted to shake her, to make her understand the reckless danger she'd courted. Instead, he found himself staring at her in confused wonder. This woman, this Eastern lady who had arrived in the territory less than 2 weeks ago, had faced down one of the most dangerous outlaws in Montana with nothing but her wits and courage. Your bluff about the letters to the marshal, he finally said, that was quick thinking. A small smile touched her lips. It wasn't entirely a bluff. I did write an account of the stagecoach attack with descriptions, Dr. Belmore took it with him when he returned to town, though I doubt it's reached any official yet. Xavier shook his head, amazement displacing anger. You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met, Ruby Kendrick. Perhaps a bit of both, she admitted. Much like a certain ranch foreman who insists on chasing outlaws. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then the children came rushing from the house, breaking the spell as they surrounded Ruby with excited questions and expressions of relief. Xavier stepped back, watching as she soothed and reassured them. Something had changed within him during those terrifying moments when he'd seen her facing Rager. The walls he'd built around his heart had begun to crumble, unable to withstand the realization of what she had come to mean to him, and what he might have lost if Rager had decided to shoot first and ask questions later. The truth he'd been avoiding crashed through his defenses. He cared for Ruby Kendrick, deeply, and the thought of losing her terrified him more than any outlaw's gun. That night, after the excitement had died down and the ranch had been secured with extra guards posted, Xavier found himself once again on the porch of his cabin, staring at the stars. But this time his thoughts weren't of Mary and what he had lost. They were of Ruby and what he might yet find, if he had the courage to reach for it. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere at the double circle remained tense. Rager's visit had proven that the ranch was a target, and everyone moved with heightened awareness. Extra guards were posted, and no one rode the range alone. For Ruby, however, the days took on a strangely peaceful rhythm. She threw herself into teaching the children, finding unexpected joy in their progress and enthusiasm. Her evenings were spent helping Mrs. Cooper or assisting Hayward with the ranch accounts, which had fallen into disarray since his wife's death. Xavier remained a complex presence in her life, sometimes distant, sometimes unexpectedly near. She would look up from a lesson to find him watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable, or encounter him in the kitchen at dawn, sharing coffee in comfortable silence before the day began. Something had shifted between them since the confrontation with Rager, but neither seemed ready to name it. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, with the children given a half-day holiday, Ruby found herself walking alone by the stream that ran behind the main house. The aspen leaves had begun to turn, splashing the landscape with gold against the evergreen pines. She'd grown to love this land in the short time she'd been here, its harshness balanced by moments of breathtaking beauty. Mind some company. She turned to find Xavier approaching, hatless, the sun bringing out auburn highlights in his dark hair. He looked younger somehow, less burdened than usual. "I'd welcome it," she replied honestly. He fell into step beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. They walked in companionable silence for a while, following the stream's meandering path. "The children are doing well with their studies," Xavier finally said. "Hayward's pleased with their progress." "They're bright and eager to learn," Ruby replied. "It makes teaching them a joy." Xavier nodded, then asked unexpectedly, "Do you miss Philadelphia?" Ruby considered the question carefully. "I miss certain aspects of it, museums, libraries, concerts, the predictability of city life." She smiled slightly. "Indoor plumbing." That drew a chuckle from Xavier, the sound so rare and wonderful that Ruby found herself staring at him in delighted surprise. "But no," she continued more seriously, "I don't miss my life there. It was constrained, limited by expectations and circumstances beyond my control." "And here?" Xavier asked, his blue eyes studying her intently. "Do you feel constrained here?" "Oddly, no," Ruby admitted. "Despite the physical dangers and hardships, I feel more myself here than I ever did in Philadelphia." As if the very openness of the landscape allows for a corresponding openness of spirit. Xavier nodded as if he understood precisely what she meant. The territory strips away pretenses. For better or worse, it reveals what people are truly made of. "And what am I made of, Mr. Dawson?" Ruby asked impulsively, "in your estimation?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Courage," he said quietly, "intelligence, compassion, and a stubborn streak a mile wide." Ruby laughed softly. "That last part sounds more like criticism than compliment." "Not at all," Xavier replied seriously. "That stubbornness saved the children when Rager came calling. It might have saved all of us." They resumed walking, the conversation shifting to lighter topics: the upcoming harvest festival in town, the twins' fascination with the new litter of barn kittens, the first snow that would likely arrive within weeks. As they circled back toward the ranch, Xavier hesitated, then said with careful casualness, "Hayward tells me he's offered you a permanent position managing the ranch accounts after his sister's children return to Helena." "Yes," Ruby confirmed. "It's a generous offer." "Are you considering it?" There was something in his tone that made Ruby look at him sharply, a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "I am," she said honestly. "Though I haven't given him my answer yet." "What's holding you back?" Xavier asked, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Ruby took a deep breath, deciding on honesty. "Uncertainty about my place here." About whether I truly belong. Xavier turned to her then, something resolute in his expression. You belong here more than most who were born to it, Ruby Kendrick. I've never seen anyone adapt to frontier life with more grace or determination. The unexpected praise warmed her. Thank you. They had reached the edge of the ranch yard, where their paths would naturally diverge, Ruby to the main house, Xavier to oversee the afternoon work. But instead of the usual nod of farewell, Xavier surprised her by asking, "Would you join me for supper tonight?" At my cabin. The invitation was so unexpected that Ruby momentarily lost her composure. Supper at your cabin. A faint flush colored Xavier's cheekbones. Yes, I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent stew. 7 o'clock if you're free. Ruby knew she should decline. A proper lady didn't dine alone with a bachelor at his private residence. But propriety seemed a distant concern compared to the opportunity to understand the complex man standing before her. I'd be delighted, she said simply. Xavier's smile, genuine and unguarded, was worth whatever social rules she might be breaking. That evening, Ruby took extra care with her appearance, selecting her best dress, a deep green that complemented her fair coloring, and arranging her honey blonde hair in a simple but elegant style. She told herself it was merely respect for the occasion, not vanity or any deeper motivation. Mrs. Cooper watched her preparations with knowing eyes but made no comment beyond offering a shawl against the evening chill. Xavier's cabin, when Ruby arrived promptly at 7, had been transformed from the utilitarian space she'd glimpsed during her nighttime visit. A cheerful fire burned in the stone hearth. The small table was covered with a clean cloth and set with what appeared to be the cabin's only matching dishes, and the scent of cooking filled the warm air. Xavier himself looked different, freshly shaved, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing a clean shirt with his usual denims. He greeted her with an awkward formality that gradually eased as the evening progressed. The stew was indeed decent, beef with potatoes and carrots from the ranch garden, accompanied by fresh bread that Xavier admitted Mrs. Cooper had provided. They talked easily, finding common ground in books they'd both read, observations about the children's education, and stories of their respective childhoods, Xavier's on a small farm in Ohio, Ruby's in Philadelphia. Only as they lingered over coffee did the conversation turn more personal. May I ask you something, Xavier? Ruby ventured, using his given name deliberately. He nodded, his expression open in a way she'd rarely seen. Mrs. Cooper told me about your wife, Ruby said gently. About Mary, would you tell me about her? Xavier's face stilled, and for a moment Ruby feared she'd overstepped. But then he set down his coffee cup and began to speak in a low, measured voice. We met in Ohio after I returned from my time with the cavalry. She was the daughter of the local doctor, educated, refined, full of life and opinions. A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. Everyone said she could do better than a former soldier with no prospects, but Mary never cared what others thought. Ruby listened, honored by his willingness to share this most personal history. We married against her parents' wishes, Xavier continued. When I decided to come west to make a fresh start, she insisted on coming too, said we were partners in everything, good or bad. His voice roughened. She loved it here, the openness, the freedom. She had plans for a proper garden, for children running around the yard. We were going to build a bigger cabin, start our own ranch eventually. She sounds remarkable, Ruby said softly. She was. Xavier's eyes met hers, pain and something else mingling in their blue depths. When the fever came, it took her so quickly there wasn't even time to get the doctor from town. 3 days from first symptoms to the end. I couldn't save her, couldn't do anything but watch her slip away. Ruby reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. I'm so sorry, Xavier. He turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting in a gentle clasp. After I didn't want to feel anything. It hurt too much, so I built walls, focused on work, took risks because in some ways I didn't care if I lived or died. And now, Ruby asked, her heart pounding. Xavier's eyes held her steadily. Now I find myself caring very much whether I live or die, because of you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Ruby's breath caught in her throat. When I saw you facing Rager, Xavier continued, his voice low and intense, I realized what it would mean to lose you. And it terrified me more than anything has in 3 years. Xavier, Ruby whispered, unable to find words for the emotions swelling in her chest. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know you came here expecting to marry another man. I know your circumstances have forced you to accept Hayward's offer of employment. I just needed you to understand why I've been distant. And why that's changing. Ruby squeezed his hand gently. I came here expecting to marry a man who had promised me security and companionship. I never expected to find someone who would make me feel truly seen and valued for exactly who I am. Hope flickered in Xavier's eyes. What are you saying, Ruby? I'm saying that in the short time I've known you, you've become more important to me than Thomas Welling ever was in 3 years of correspondence. The admission felt both terrifying and freeing. I'm saying that I care for you, Xavier Dawson, walls and all. The moment hung suspended between them, fragile, powerful, transformative. Then Xavier rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and gently drew her to her feet. Standing before him, Ruby could see the battle in his eyes, desire warring with restraint, hope with fear. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he raised his free hand to cup her cheek. May I? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Instead of answering, Ruby lifted her face to his. Their lips met in a kiss that began as gentle as a whisper but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest. Years of loneliness and walls crumbling on both sides as they discovered each other. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly dazed, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he confessed. Never wanted to. Nor did I, Ruby replied, thinking of her shattered trust after Thomas's betrayal. But here we are. Here we are, Xavier agreed, wonder in his voice. So what happens now? Ruby smiled up at him. Now we take things slowly, get to know each other properly, build something real. Xavier nodded, his arms still around her waist. I can do slow, he promised. Though being near you every day and remembering how you taste might make it challenging. Ruby laughed softly, joy bubbling up from a place she'd thought long dry. Perhaps not too slowly then. Later, as Xavier walked her back to the main house under a canopy of stars, their hands clasped and their futures suddenly, unexpectedly entwined, Ruby marveled at the strange path that had brought her here. Thomas's betrayal had led her to Xavier's truth. Her loss had opened the door to finding something far more precious. The frontier might be harsh and unforgiving, but it had given her something Philadelphia never could, the freedom to discover her own strength and the chance to love a man who saw her completely. 2 weeks later, as autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and crimson, a letter arrived at the Double Circle Ranch addressed to Ruby Kendrick. The familiar handwriting made her heart skip a beat, though not for the reasons it once might have. She took the letter to the privacy of her room, hesitating before breaking the seal. Whatever Thomas Welling had to say, it couldn't change her present or her future, but it might finally explain her past. The letter was dated from Denver, Colorado territory, nearly a month earlier. My dear Ruby. By the time you receive this, you will have discovered I am no longer at the Double Circle Ranch. Circumstances forced my hasty departure, circumstances I hope you will understand were beyond my control. I have established myself in a promising business venture here in Denver and am now in a position to fulfill my promise to you. If you're still willing to honor our engagement, please come to Denver immediately. Enclosed is enough money for your passage. Send a wire to the address below when you arrive. With fondest regards, Thomas. Ruby stared at the letter, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. The man who had once been the center of her hopes and dreams now felt like a stranger. His calculated words, his casual assumption that she would still be waiting, his complete lack of explanation for his deception, it all confirmed what she had come to suspect about Thomas Welling's character. What is it? Xavier asked from the doorway, concern in his voice. She hadn't heard him knock. Wordlessly, Ruby handed him the letter. His expression darkened as he read, jaw tightening with each line. The nerve of him, Xavier finally said, looking up. To assume you'd still come running after he abandoned you, stole from the ranch, and left you to find out the truth from strangers. It doesn't matter, Ruby said, surprised by how genuinely she meant it. Thomas Welling has no power over me anymore. Xavier studied her face. You're sure? Completely, Ruby took the letter from his hands and deliberately tore it in half, then quarters. My future is here, Xavier. With the children I'm teaching, with the work I'm doing for Mr. Hayward. She met his gaze steadily. With you, if you want that. The vulnerability in her last words hung between them. Though they had spent nearly every evening together since that first dinner at his cabin, talking, sharing, learning each other's histories and dreams, neither had spoken directly of long-term commitments. Xavier crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands in his. "I do want that," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "more than I've wanted anything since Mary died. But Ruby, I need to be sure you're choosing this life, choosing me, not just because Welling proved unworthy." "I'm choosing you because you proved worthy," Ruby replied simply. "Because in you, I've found a man of honor and courage. A man who sees me clearly and values what he sees. A man I've come to love." The last words slipped out unplanned, but Ruby didn't regret them. They were true, and life on the frontier had taught her the value of honest speech. Xavier's breath caught. "Say that again." Ruby smiled up at him. "I love you, Xavier Dawson. Not because you rescued me from outlaws or offered me shelter, but because of who you are, walls, scars, and all." Xavier pulled her into his arms, his kiss fierce and tender at once. "I love you too," he murmured against her lips. "God help me, I tried not to, tried to keep those walls up, but you found your way through every one of them." They stood together in the late afternoon light, the torn pieces of Thomas's letter scattered forgotten at their feet. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythms, horses in the corral, cattle in the pastures, hands calling to one another as they finished the day's work. It was a hard life, but an honest one. And now, for both of them, no longer a lonely one. 1 week later, Ruby was in the middle of a geography lesson when the distant sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful afternoon. She immediately gathered the children away from the windows, her heart racing with fear and memory. "Stay here," she instructed Elizabeth. "Keep the others inside, away from the windows." She rushed downstairs to find Mrs. Cooper already at the front window, peering cautiously outside. "What's happening?" Ruby asked, joining her. "Raiders," the older woman said grimly, "but not Rager's gang. These look like a different outfit." Through the window, Ruby could see 5 mounted men exchanging fire with ranch hands near the corrals. Xavier was there, directing the defense, his movements calm and precise even amid danger. "Why are they attacking in broad daylight?" Ruby wondered aloud. "Desperation, maybe," Mrs. Cooper suggested. "The early snows trapped some of the outlier gangs in the valley longer than usual." Ruby watched anxiously as the battle continued. The raiders seemed focused on the horse corrals rather than the main house, a small mercy that kept the children safer, but still a serious threat to the ranch. Suddenly, one of the raiders broke away from the main group and rode hard toward the barn where several prize horses were stabled. Xavier saw the danger and pursued on foot, firing as he ran. Ruby gasped as the raider wheeled his horse and took deliberate aim at Xavier. Without conscious thought, she grabbed Hayward's shotgun from beside the door and rushed outside, ignoring Mrs. Cooper's cry of alarm. The distance was too great for an accurate shot with the shotgun, but Ruby fired into the air anyway. The unexpected blast startled the raider, throwing off his aim. His shot went wide, missing Xavier by inches. That moment of distraction was all Xavier needed. His next shot caught the raider in the shoulder, toppling him from his horse. Seeing their companion fall and the determined resistance from the ranch hands, the remaining raiders decided to cut their losses. They fired a few covering shots before galloping away, leaving their wounded comrade behind. The sudden silence after gunfire was disorienting. Ruby stood frozen on the porch, the shotgun still in her hands, as Xavier secured the fallen raider with help from 2 other hands. Only when the immediate danger had passed did Xavier look toward the house. His eyes widened when he saw Ruby with the shotgun, and he strode toward her with a mixture of relief and exasperation visible on his face. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said as he reached her, gently taking the weapon from her trembling hands, "and I can't decide which." "I couldn't just watch," Ruby said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not when he had you in his sights." Xavier's expression softened. "Thank you, but next time please stay inside with the children." "Next time," Ruby raised an eyebrow, finding unexpected humor in the moment. "You're assuming there will be more raiders." "This is the frontier, Ruby," Xavier reminded her, though his lips twitched with a suppressed smile. "There's always a next time." That evening, after the raider had been taken to town for medical attention and imprisonment, and the ranch had settled back into an uneasy calm, Xavier came to find Ruby in the main house library. The children were in bed and she sat alone by the fire, a book open but unread in her lap. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her. "A dangerous pastime," Ruby teased gently, closing her book. Xavier smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "Today made me realize something. Life out here is unpredictable, dangerous. There are no guarantees." "I'm well aware," Ruby said, her mind flashing to gunfire and fear, "which is why I don't want to wait any longer." Xavier leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "Ruby Kendrick, will you marry me? Not someday, not when things are more settled, but now. Soon. I love you, and I don't want to waste another day pretending we're just friends, or that I can be content with seeing you across the dinner table and walking you to the door." The directness of his proposal, so unlike Thomas's careful, distant letters, took Ruby's breath away. Yet it felt right, as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. "Yes," she said simply, her heart full. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Dawson." His smile transformed his face, erasing the last traces of the walls he'd built around his heart. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss a promise of the life they would build together. "When?" he asked, his forehead resting against hers. "As soon as the minister can come from town," Ruby replied without hesitation. "I don't want to wait either." They were married 2 weeks later in the Double Circle's main house, with Hayward giving the bride away and the children serving as attendants. Ruby wore a simple cream dress that Mrs. Cooper had helped her sew, with late autumn wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. As they exchanged vows before the small gathering of ranch hands and neighbors, Ruby marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She had come to Montana Territory as a lost bride, searching for a man who had betrayed her trust and abandoned his promises. Instead, she had found a home, a purpose, and a love deeper and truer than anything she had imagined possible. Xavier's hands were steady as he placed the simple gold band on her finger. His eyes, clear and blue as the Montana sky, held hers with a promise that needed no words, a promise of partnership, protection, and passion that would weather whatever storms the frontier might bring. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Their first kiss as a married couple was brief but tender, mindful of their audience, yet unmistakably charged with the promise of privacy to come. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful, food prepared by Mrs. Cooper and the neighboring ranchers' wives, music provided by a fiddle-playing ranch hand, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Through it all, Xavier kept Ruby close, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her go. When they finally slipped away to Xavier's cabin, now their cabin, the night had grown cold, stars brilliant in the clear sky. Xavier surprised Ruby by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," he said softly as he set her down inside. The cabin had been transformed again, this time with new curtains at the windows, a larger bed with a colorful quilt, and fresh flowers on the table, all evidence of the ranch community's efforts to welcome its newest bride. "It's perfect," Ruby said, taking in the simple comforts that made the space a home. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the new quilt, the barriers between them finally and completely dissolved. Xavier's touch, gentle yet ardent, reverent yet passionate, taught Ruby what true intimacy could be between a man and woman who had chosen each other with clear eyes and open hearts. "I never imagined I could be this happy again," Xavier murmured against her hair as they drifted toward sleep. "When Mary died, I thought that part of my life was over. And I never imagined finding love in a place so far from everything I knew," Ruby replied, nestled against his chest. "When Thomas's deception was revealed, I thought my future had crumbled." Xavier's arms tightened around her. "We were both lost in different ways. And somehow found each other," Ruby completed the thought. "Perhaps that's what love is, finding your way through loss and fear to the person who sees you truly." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall outside their window, Xavier and Ruby Dawson held each other close in their frontier home, no longer lost, no longer alone. Together they had built something neither had believed possible, a love strong enough to weather the harsh realities of the Montana Territory and tender enough to heal the wounds of the past. Their hearts, once walled and wandering, had truly converged.